Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another round of lightning talks. In this session, we'll have Jessica Smith and Justin Foyer going first with the Palladium project, and then it'll be followed by Jack O'Sullivan with the email handling and digital preservation system. Jessica, if you would like to share your screen now.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you see that? Is that working?
Yep, working.
Fantastic. Let me start from the beginning. There we go. Brilliant. So, hi, I'm Jessica Smith, as Ruby says, and I'm the Creative Arts Archivist at the John Rylands Library, University of Manchester. And I'm presenting today with my colleague Jochen on the Palladium project. And let's get started. So just a little background about the project. The Rylands Library has been acquiring the email archive of indie poetry publisher Carcanet Press in addition to its paper records since 2012. The collection is preserved in our digital preservation system, Preservica, and in 2021 we introduced management of the collection via ePad. So I know it's really unlikely in this audience that nobody is unfamiliar with ePad, and there's anybody unfamiliar with ePad in it, but just in case, it's an open source software that offers significant tools to assist in appraisal, allowing for the labeling, restricting and bulk restricting of messages. It offers lexicon functionality, automated entity extraction and management, and it uses a custom natural language processing toolkit. It has been our experience so far with ePad that all of these processes still involve significant human intervention and oversight though. Great. So in 2019, we were successful in securing funding for a project called Providing Access to Large Literary Archives in a Digital Medium, or Palladium for short. It commenced in February 2021 and was completed in February 2022. It was planned with an initial block of time for experimentation, and our involvement in the ePad Plus projects really concurrently freed us up to focus in this project on appraisal, management and mediated access. We're only able to consider mediated access at this stage for the email archive as it's closed at the request of the donor, and also presents significant challenges, as everyone will know, in terms of the regulatory framework. So these on the slide are our stated outputs for the project. I know there's far too much text on this slide and I apologize. I think we just probably had too many goals. So for our exploration of appraisal, we first carried out a review of the practices at other organisations, including the capstone and funnel approaches. And as is often the way, we decided to trial a combination of them. So we conducted a survey after that of the categories of email that we could find in the Carcanet archive. Some are specifically related to publishing, but many fell into sort of standard organisational administrative categories like employment, finance, facilities. And this was used in conjunction with the genres of paper record in the Carcanet archive to create a selection criteria and an appraisal rubric to guide our practices. So our first appraisal experiment was to see if we might label some of the most obvious candidates for removal from the collection. There had been no appraisal thus far on the collection, and we identified the categories that you can see on the slide. We were able to bulk label some of them, and some of them had to be labeled individually. And in this initial appraisal exercise, we were able to label just under 34,000 email, which were then removed from the collection when it was transferred to the processing module. We invited 3 poets whose email is held in the archive to participate in a collaborative appraisal exercise. We wanted to see if we could make subsets of the collection available for access via ePad's discovery module. So we provided access to the email they'd sent to Carcanet by identifying them in ePad and then exporting them as mbox files. I'm going to say there were decided idiosyncrasies in the approaches of the poets, and if we were prepared to repeat this process, I think we'd probably need to develop much more detailed supporting guidance. We certainly needed to carry out our own additional assessment of the material prior to clearing it for access. We also looked into creating a sub-collection that could be made available by ePad's delivery module, which, as you'll know, is used for moderated full text access in a reading room setting. We used this sub-collection to test different mechanisms across ePad's 4 modules, and the correspondent chosen for this experiment was poet Elaine Feinstein. Her emails document many aspects of publishing, particularly editing and publicity, but Feinstein also had a long friendship with Michael Schmidt, who's Carcanet's managing editor, So in amongst the professional, there was also discussion of family, friends, personal matters, medical matters. So we thought this email would be a really suitable test case for our appraisal rubric, and in the longer term for the redaction tool we've developed. So each email was appraised individually in this case, a process which took several weeks, partly due to the volume of the material and partly due to the length and content of the messages. We applied a set of bespoke labels to it in EPAD to indicate the restricted email and also to mark up those that were cleared for transfer to the next module. So this was a really useful exercise, but it became clear that the time it takes to process even this small amount of material was just not sustainable for administering general access requests. So in our combined appraisal experiments, we initially appraised and labeled an estimated 37,000 emails in EPAD altogether. So this is a brief summary of some of the development work we were able to carry out during the project to try and possibly augment some of EPAD to fit the things that we were trying to do with it at the time. So we're really fortunate at Manchester to have a team of developers in-house at the library who are willing to accommodate the project. The work was led by requests from the project archivist for Palladium, and we carried out a combination of new work and sort of fixing issues as they came up. So with the approval of Stanford and the EPAD working group, we think this work is going to be merged into the main EPAD code within the next month or so. So we're really excited for that. So initially, we added an option to download the email header metadata for search results as a CSV file. We actually used this primarily for the production of data visualizations, but it could be used for any purpose which required that data set. This option was previously available for entity data sets only. We chose to make the structure of the folder in which an email has been stored visible in the header metadata. This was really useful context, I found, because some of the email accounts were really, really complicated. They had a lot of different folders, and being able to see where someone else had stored it made the whole chain of email just much more clear in terms of the decisions we were making. We also made some augmentations to the correspondence list. It's now possible to merge entries and email addresses which relate to the same person much more easily. We made it possible to export a subset of the collection to the delivery module rather than the collection in its entirety, which means we can work on making select sections or individual poets available to access in a kind of more product, less process kind of approach. We also amended the delivery module so that the email addresses are partially redacted, which means we're not giving out current contact details for the people in the collection, which is really, really valuable for us. But I think the piece of dev work that we're most excited about, and certainly the one we've had the most questions about so far, is the option to redact selected text within an email. So in this augmentation, EPAD now saves a preservation copy and a normal copy of an email message to ensure that message integrity is preserved. There's also an option to export either version of the email from EPAD as mbox files. We've chosen at Manchester to represent redacted text as a series of asterisks for continuity and to mark redacted email with a set of bespoke labels to make them really easy to identify en masse. An icon allows you to toggle between the unredacted and redacted messages as required. So I do have a short demo of that particular bit of functionality, and this is when we just pray that that works. Here we go. Great, so this is an email I've sent that's in EPAD in the Carcanet email archive, and here is the toggle we have that allows you to make the redactions, to make the edits. So if you open the padlock, the email is now gives you this option here to modify email content. And this is me taking out a little bit of the content. And we've chosen to use a couple of asterisks just as sort of so that you can't see how much text has been redacted. We use a standard 8 each time. So if you click apply, you can now see that there are now 2 versions of the email. One has asterisks and has redacted data, and the other doesn't. So if you wanted to give access to most of an email and not a tiny bit, that's now an option, which is really exciting. And so if you close the padlock, we're back on the preservation copy. And then what we have done is apply, as I said, bespoke labels that we created just to make it very clear that selected data has been redacted. Great. So that's just going to show you, toggling between the 2 views. So it will then load both your preservation view and your access view. Fantastic. So we really wanted to produce resources for this project that would be sort of generally applicable outside of our own organisation. And it's our hope that they will be useful to other institutions, and that we're very happy to share them with anybody who's interested in any of the work we did. We produced an acquisition workflow, but in truth, we've never followed the same process twice for acquisition. There's also something that can be improved upon or a new approach to try. The full project report was initially intended as an internal record, but some of the issues we've encountered might be useful to other people. So we're very happy to make it available on request if anybody'd like to see all of the dev work we did and how. We produced some user guides and archivist guides, which include summaries of the appraisal and access progress we've made, but also an in-depth beginner's guide to some of the EPAD functions, because we really needed that ourselves when we were getting started. We've created a short document that tries to answer some of the frequently asked questions from donors, and also make some suggestions for donors about what is useful to prepare collections for transfer to an archive repository. We produced a series of blog posts and social media posts, and I really think it's been a really valuable means of promotion. It's pretty much the only way people find the project, or the most obvious way people have found the project. So it's been great to see people engage with it in that way on the Rylands blog. So the Palladium project team consulted with academic staff at the University of Manchester to talk about the kind of research questions they would be interested in asking of large anonymised data sets, which can be produced from EPAD. So using their suggestions, the data visualizations you can see on the slide were generated with using the free versions of software applications Data Wrapper and Gephi. They were created using exported results of entity, lexicon, and advanced searches, and most required manual checking, collating, and data cleansing, inevitably. Our hope was that these were examples of what was possible. You know, we couldn't spend a lot of time on this, but really wanted to show that these were options that researchers could take advantage of and could utilize for the archive without us necessarily having to give out any personal data. So we worked with two artists for the project, Mary Griffiths and Gregory O'Brien, who were connected with Carcanet, and to produce creative responses to the email archive. Mary requested access to the email of which related really to the posthumous publication of a poetry collection called A Responsibility to Awe by astrophysicist and poet Rebecca Elson, who's having a real vogue at the moment, which is lovely. So Mary writes of her piece, in almost 10,000 emailed words, Elson is mentioned by name only 130 times. So my drawing will express these words in geometric form. And Greg asked for access to the email of Scottish poet and novelist Frank Cupner. Greg had heard that Frank once worked as an electrician, so he used excerpts of Michael Schmidt's email to Frank and vice versa within the piece. So they're a great example of the potential of the archive to inspire creative works. We're delighted with them, and they now form part of our digital holdings for the Carcanet archive. So despite making good progress, I think, with our procedures for appraisal, the email we were able to appraise with concerted effort over several months represents only a really small portion of the total collection. And the time the process takes when carried out at item level is just not sustainable to comply with access requests. The project report proposes several potential ways forward, but essentially our appraisal experience presented all the challenges that you might expect, and certainly that we expected. This project would not have been achievable without collaboration between the project archivists, Carcanet Press, academics, developers, and consultants. It's a real testament to the new working practice that digital collections require of us as a profession. We're particularly indebted to Jochen and the software developers. Without their assistance, Palladium would not have been possible. The project is a stepping stone in our work with email archives, but we feel as though we're really able to make some positive progress here. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Jochen is here as well. If anybody has any questions about the development work that I'm not able to answer, he's very kindly come along to assist with those. And if you have any other questions for me, that would be great. Thank you.
Also, just want to remind people that you can feel free to jump on the mic if you want to ask a question directly. So we have a question come in, just clarifying the partial redactions are done manually, message by message, or is there another way?
Yes, it has to be manual at the moment. Yeah, it has to
Manually.
be, yeah, message by message, yeah, individual. I think people
Sounds
were
like consuming work.
Yes, I think people are particularly twitchy about it. So that's why we've got so many checks and balances in place as an idea, the idea of amending the record in any way. But it is something we were asked about quite a lot. And it's certainly something that I know Sally's been asked about at Stanford.
And another question, sorry if I missed it, but Jessica, are you willing to share your project documentation, user guides, FAQ for donors, etc.?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'd be delighted. Yeah. Yes, please do just get in touch. We'd be very happy to share them.
And just as a reminder, presentation slides are linked on the session, so you'll be able to access their presenters' emails if they included them. Another question, will you be submitting the additional functionality to EPAD?
Yeah, our hope is that it's going to be merged with the main EPAD code within the next month or so. Jochen will be able to clarify that, but we're just sort of finishing off the user guide part of it. But we've got the go ahead from the steering group and from Stanford to add this to the main EPAD code, so we're pretty excited about that.
Ooh. Okay, so another question, when you sent the poets their emails as mboxes, did you provide instructions on how they would view those files?
Extensive instructions in different, we provided Mac instructions and Word instructions. We did it over Zoom, we did it on paper, and still one of them just couldn't do it. It was a challenge for sure. It really, I think it would have been quicker if we just sat next to them, honestly. It would have, yeah. So it was, yeah, it was a great idea in theory, but in practice it needed a lot of hand holding, and also the way they appraised was completely different as well. So really some more, I mean, when we talk about appraisal as archivists, we're quite clear what we mean. When I ask someone else to appraise their email, they were like, well, I don't care, do it, whatever, yeah, whatever you want. Which wasn't exactly what we were hoping. You know, it's interesting that to have that level of, yeah, that level of freedom with it, but we were sort of hoping for a bit more nuance, I think, in the response.
And direction. A starting point, maybe.
Anything. Yeah, anything really. But he was very clear that he really, you know, anything he'd sent in as an email was fine for sharing. So,
free for all.
Yeah, so I think he just couldn't bear to try and open the software one more time.
Well, if anybody has any questions that come up, Jessica and Jochen, sorry, Joe, and they call them, oh, well, we got one more question. Love the creative responses. Can you speak more about doing this outreach to the creative community? And did you provide guidance on what types of output they could create?
Yes, this was one of I mean, having these come in was so wonderful. They're the things I'd never imagined being inspired by an email archive. I think it's a real testament to what this, you know, the potential for all of this data and what it can do. The brief was simply respond creatively. These are two artists that were linked to Carcanet Press already, so they already had a relationship with the donor, so they trusted them to share their records, and they trusted that they were in favor of the responses they produced. But they're so different, as you can see. They're such different responses to the same kind of thing. So really, we talked about the kind of things we could provide and the sort of the preparation we would need to do to provide those records. And then we just kind of left them to it, and what came back was pretty great. So.
Well, if there are any more questions, we invite you to do the Q&A, and you can type out some of the answers while you hang back and our next presenter gets ready.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Jack O'Sullivan from Preservica with email handling in a digital preservation system. Jack, I believe you should have all the privileges, so feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Hi, yes, so my name's Jack O'Sullivan. I am an engineering lead here at Preservica. So I've been working at Preservica and in the field of digital preservation for coming up on 12 years now. I'm currently the technical lead for the innovation team here at Preservica, who, as well as having a broad responsibility for looking at innovative uses of digital preservation and additions to our product going forward, we have broad responsibility for the sort of core format-based digital preservation functionality in the system. So I'm also a member of the premise editorial committee. And obviously what I want to talk about today is emails, how we think about emails, how we handle emails within Preservica. And I'll provide a very brief overview of Preservica and who we are. For those of you who aren't yet familiar with us, I'll talk a bit about how emails fit within our data model. I've got a brief video demo of what that ends up looking like in practice. And I'll talk a bit about how our approach extends to dealing with mailboxes as well as individual messages. So first up, for those of you who don't know us, Preservica is a long-term digital preservation system. So we are based around OAS principles. We provide ingest, data management, active ongoing preservation functionality, and we provide access, and so that means direct access to our direct customers, obviously, but we also provide public portals for end user access, so the customers of our customers can access their data through Preservica's technology. We run Preservica as a cloud service in a number of countries now. We've been running our cloud services for over 10 years at this point. We have a large number of customers who are using those cloud services, but we also have a smaller number of on-premise customers, so institutions who run Preservica within their own data centers. And some of those on-premise customers have systems that have been running in production for much longer than our cloud systems, so some of them going back almost 20 years, I think. And we have customers in a number of different fields. So we have large national memory institutions, so think national libraries, national archives. We have museum customers, we have corporate archives. We have all flavors of local government, so city, county, state governments, regional governments, and those come from a number of different countries with different policies. And we have educational institutions, so universities, colleges, even schools. And we have a large number of customers that probably don't fit into any of those categories. And we have a variety of customers in terms of the size of their collections as well. So we have some customers who are responsible for relatively small collections, but others who have terabytes, if not petabytes of data in their systems. And in terms of the size of customers, in terms of the number of direct users, we have customers who run their own digital preservation departments, their own teams, and they've got bodies of 10, 20 people using the system, right the way down to lone arrangers where there's only one person in the institution who is directly using Preservica. We're not specifically an email system, so we handle any kind of digital content, and that means born digital and digitized. We're not covering the same kind of appraisal and curation scenarios as tools like EPAD or Rotom. We're really focused on preservation of and access to the materials that our customers bring to the system, and some of that includes email data. And all of that is to say that we actually see quite a variety of different use cases. So we have customers who use different email systems, who take different approaches towards how they're going to preserve email. And what we're trying to do is really model email handling in a way that fits as many of these use cases as we can. What we're not doing is providing a very tailored solution that fits one particular workflow or one particular use case. We're trying to think about email generically so that it can hopefully be useful to everybody. Which brings me on to how we deal with email, how we model it, how we think about it within the system. And what we're trying to do is to describe and handle email in a way that is technology independent. So it doesn't matter whether you've come from an Outlook system or a Gmail system. And we're trying to think of the key characteristics of what an email actually is. And we can start thinking about the constituent parts of an email. So there's obviously a message body, and that's primarily text in most cases, but we also know that it can come with detailed markup, HTML often, or rich text format to describe exactly how the email should be displayed. And it can also directly embed content. So typically you see images directly in line with the text, but you can embed other types of content as well like that. There's also generally contextual metadata that you get from things like a subject line, which is fairly obvious when you say it, that emails have subjects, but not all electronic communication does have that kind of metadata. Some of it just has the from and the to, and then the actual body of the communication. So email is somewhat different in that regard. There's obviously context around who the email was sent by, who the recipients of that email are. You might have flags to say whether this is urgent or important, or whether it has priority. But even in terms of the recipients, there's also different classes of recipients. So you can send an email directly to somebody, you can CC somebody in, you can BCC somebody in. And all of that subtlety creates rich contextual metadata for that record. It gives you an idea of who the intended audience is, who can see this, who knows who else can see the email. All of this might be important when you're considering how to handle that record. And the act of transmitting email creates further metadata, which we might think of as provenance metadata in the email headers. So you can trace the path through which the email was actually sent. So you can see server headers every time it bounces through a mail server, which might give you some important provenance information if you're dealing with questions about whether emails are legitimate, whether they really came from the person that the to field seems to claim they came from. And on top of all of that, there's the potential for other digital objects to be included as part of that communication as attachments. And sometimes attachments are fairly incidental to the email as a whole. But sometimes they're the entire point of the communication. The message body might only be a single line saying, please see the attached, and really all of the context of the record is there in that attachment. And these are digital files. They exist in digital file formats, and that means that they have their own preservation risks that are independent of the overall preservation risk of the email itself. So we have to consider that. So broadly, we have the message, the metadata, and some other arbitrary content, which means email is really a complex digital object. But when we think about it in Preservica, any individual email we do think of as a single piece of information. It's we use the term asset in Preservica. It's a single logical piece of information that somebody is trying to preserve, and it's the level at which you would interact with that object. It's the level at which you provide detailed descriptive metadata. It's the level at which we think about trying to display or render that information. But we might have multiple representations of that information, so different ways of encoding it. In the case of email, you might think of having an MSG file that came out of Microsoft Outlook, and that's really your preservation representation. That is the information that you were sent. But it's quite a difficult format to deal with in terms of rendering. So you might set up a way of generating something else like an EML for an access copy that's a bit less tied into a single piece of software. And in general, when we think about digital assets, a representation is very often a single piece of content, a single file. So if you think about a Word document or a JPEG or a PDF or a video file, these are single pieces of information that encapsulate the entire asset. But we've already said that email fits a class of object where that's not necessarily true. So we might have, in any given representation, we will have multiple, or might have multiple pieces of content that actually are required to provide a rendering of the information itself. And so we have a term content object where we describe a logical block of content. So typically the email message file itself will be a single content object, but we will create content objects for each of the attachments that there are to that email. And that means that we can start to consider the preservation risk of each of those bits of contents individually as well. So if you have an email that has an image attached, the original form of that attachment might be a TIFF file, which you may, for various institutional reasons, want to normalize away to something else like JPEG 2000. So you want to only deal with JPEG 2000 images in your repository. So you need to be able to migrate that attachment independently of the email as a whole, and still have the context where we know that that JPEG 2000 is actually an attachment to the original message. And we do this even in cases like MSG, where all of the attachments are bundled up into the same digital file as the message in the original form. So logically, we can determine that there should be these other bits of content, and we can actually describe those within Preservica, even if we don't have a separate file for them. So what I've got here is a brief demo of what all of that actually translates to in practice. So what we're looking at here is my laptop. I've got an email here, which is an MSG file that came out of Microsoft Outlook. And I can open that directly in Outlook, and I can see, yeah, it's an email. It's got recipient information. It's got sender information. There's an attachment, which is a TIFF. My message body has some markup, so it's not just plain text. I've got embedded images, so the logo there, and if we scroll down through the message body, there's some other examples of images that are sort of embedded directly in line with the email. So this is quite a complex object already. So if I jump into my Preservica system, what I can do, because I've only got one message to deal with, and it's actually relatively small, I can just drag and drop that into the part of my repository where I want that email to live. So that gets uploaded and then ingested into Preservica's system. So it goes through processes like checking for integrity, doing checksums, checking for viruses. And we do a robust characterization. So we identify the file format, and then based on that, we might do some further characterization to see exactly what the characteristics of that individual file are. And when all of that is finished, what I've got is a single asset in my system that represents that email. So if I open that up, I've got some descriptive metadata. It's very basic here at the moment, but I can add to that later on. And if I look in the preservation history, I can start to see what is actually represented there. So I've got a preservation representation that contains my original MSG. I can download that straight back out if I wanted to. And this is the characterization information that we've generated. So we can see this is an Outlook email. We can get the exact format from Pronom. We can see how it was identified, but because it's an email, we can also start to pull out some of the other contextual metadata. So we know that we can read the subject line and the sender, what date it was sent, and various other bits of metadata. But because we know there was also an attachment, what I've got when I look at this is a separate piece of content that represents the attachment. So it's pointing to a TIFF file. There's no file size here because we haven't actually extracted this TIFF to store. During characterization, we did extract it. We did run a full characterization of it. So we've got a format from Pronom. We've got technical properties that we've extracted on the basis of the fact that this is an image. But there's no checksum there because we're not actually storing this TIFF file independently. It's still part of the MSG. But in this system, I've also got some migration policy set up to say, I actually want to retain all of my images as JPEG 2000 rather than TIFF. And I want to be able to provide rendering access to this object. So I want to create an access representation where the email is in EML format. So in the background, Preservica will have performed some file migrations. And what we can see here is I've still got my MSG, but if I drop into the attachment, I've now got the original TIFF represented, but also a JPEG 2000 version of that attachment. And if I come back up and scroll down a little bit further, I've got an access representation, and now the message is in .eml format, which we've gone ahead and characterized. And again, because that's an email format, we can pull out that contextual metadata and store that. And I've also got the attachment here. So this is using the JPEG 2000 because that was the normalization that I performed on the preservation copy. And what that enables me to do is provide a direct in-browser rendering, so users don't have to actually download the email to be able to see the content of it. We can see the subject line there. It doesn't look exactly the way it did in Outlook, but we can see the same basic set of information. So we can see who sent it, who they sent it to. We can see that we've got some of the markup rendering. So some of that will potentially have been blocked for security reasons. And if we scroll down, we can see those images directly embedded within the body. And if I click through the attachment, I can actually see the image there attached directly in the email. So I get a sense of the entire record within the context that it was intended to be shared. demo gives you a quick flavor of what that looks like for an individual email. But obviously, many of our customers are dealing with thousands or tens of thousands of emails, and usually these come in the form of entire mailboxes that are being exported from another system. So you might have a PST from Outlook or an Mbox from Gmail, or you might get those from packages like ePad or Raton. And as well as the raw emails, these generally contain extra contextual information in the form of mail folders, like showing how the email was organized. Emails are often part of a conversation or a thread, and within some mailboxes we can track this threading information as well, so we can see what emails are in reply to which other emails, and we can create links in Preservica between the various assets to represent that. But there's often also non-email content, things like calendar appointments or business cards, and we don't currently deal with those. There might also be draft or unsent emails, and sometimes those invalidate our assumptions about what an email actually is and what metadata we'll have to work with. So you might find things that have no sender or recipient information, which can cause some problems within the system. So I've got another very short demo here, so I'm not going to go through the ingest process for this, but what we are going to see here, if the video plays, is that within this folder I've got a folder called Gmail Inbox, and if I go and have a look in there, what I'll see is that I've got the original Gmail inbox as an Mbox file, so a single asset for the whole Mbox. So we keep the original that was sent to us, but we also know that it's a mailbox, so we can perform some processing and generate another set of assets, so we can read out all of the mail folders and create folders within Preservica to mimic that hierarchy. And if I drop into the inbox here, I can see the individual emails within that mail folder, and that looks very similar to the example I had before. Because we were able to do the package processing ourselves here, we've actually surfaced the email metadata as fully descriptive metadata about that asset. So some of that contextual information is just automatically brought up. And we can see that we have the same kind of representation of what the email is. So in this case, there's an EML file, so I didn't need an access representation because the preservation is directly renderable. And I've got an attachment that surfaces as a separate object. And again, I can render that directly, and I can render the attachment to show the email in line. And so that gives us a similar kind of approach to what we saw from the Archives Nationales earlier, where we sort of create parallel structures of the original mailbox, and then what that looks like as an extracted hierarchy of information and assets. So to recap, the way we think about emails in Preservica is that they're complex digital objects. They have a message, they have metadata, and they have attachments, and all of these need to be preserved together as a single asset to make sure that the email as a whole, as a record, can be understood. However, because each piece of content has its own associated preservation risk, we think of them as separate pieces of contents that we can address and preserve through individual migrations and normalizations to minimize the risk going forward. So we can also import mailboxes, and we can mirror the additional structural and contextual information that you get from a mailbox. And whilst I didn't have time to include the demo of it, that conversation thread context is preserved as links between assets within the system. And so that's all I've got prepared for today. So I'm happy to field any questions. So I can see there's one come in already that's asking that the demos have a very different user interface from our institutional Preservica instance. So yeah, the demo that I've been, or the system that I've been showing is using our next generation interface, which will be rolling out across all of our other systems fairly soon. So you should be able to get information about that from the community hub and speaking to our product representatives there. So that's the only question I've seen so far.
Next question that this just rolled in. We are Preservica user 2. I'm wondering if you can show the data model of the email on the new user interface.
Yeah, so the user interface that I was using there is our new user interface. So that's how the data model gets surfaced to the user. You see the representations of the asset within the preservation history tab, and then you can see the details of each piece of content as drop downs from that.
Okay, I'm going to give you permission to talk, Hillary. I believe you should be able to unmute now.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I was just curious because the older one, you are able to view a tree structure of the data model that shows you, okay, what is the content object, what's the generation, and what's the bit stream. I'm just curious if you can see that in the new user interface. And also when you are showing the asset and the drop-down menu of the email and the attachment, I believe the drop-down menus are the content objects, but when it is placed alongside with asset, which is information objects, it is a little bit confusing. So I'm just curious if there's a way to see the full view of the tree structure of the information objects.
So I don't think we have any direct view of that same tree structure that you're talking about. Yeah, the new interface is designed to show that in a hopefully more intuitive way than just the sort of technical details of that tree structure. But I don't have full details on that kind of product question at the moment.
I believe we have time for one more question. Reprising a question I asked a previous presenter, have you any thoughts on how to deal with and make accessible calendar entries that might come in PST files?
So we haven't explicitly looked at handling those. We are aware that there's something that we deliberately exclude from the extraction process, and that is part of the reason that we always preserve the original PST there, so that we don't actually throw away that information during the ingest, and also so that when we think of a way to deal with them, we can go back and apply that to the original PST of things that are already in the system. I mean, it feels like there should be a solution that creates like another organizational hierarchy within the system that has calendar events, but I haven't really given too much thought to how that would end up being modeled. But it's something that's sort of in our list of things we know that we should get to at some point, but it's not directly it's not on our immediate roadmap at the moment, I don't think.
Well, thank you so much for your time and presentation, Jack. We're going to go on a quick break before our next session at 11, which will feature Chris Fromm and Tom Habing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.